whatever is signed with Iran marks the New World Order. Who invests? Who rebuilds? What happens with the Strait of Hormuz? What happens to Israel? And then obviously what happens in Ukraine, Russia, and what happens to Taiwan and China. And I think those have all been agreed, and we're moving towards it with bounded escalations in order to try and get more leverage in these big changes.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Off the Cuff podcast. I am your host, Chris Martinson, and today we're going to be talking with Simon Dixon. He is the CEO and co-founder of Bank to the Future. We're going to be discussing what's happening in Iran, what the big picture is. You know me, I'm always trying to find out the big toe, the theory of everything. So what is the big toe? You know, we're all groping around trying to find it. My listeners have asked and repeatedly asked, could I get Simon back on? And so I'm very pleased to have him back on. Simon, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much for having me back. I had a real good feedback on the first one. So look forward to seeing what we can discuss.
Well, fantastic. So last time, I think where we left it, and there's a part I want to get into ultimately, which is like, well, given all this that we're about to talk about in the front half, what do you do? Right. And so we kind of left a little cliffhanger. People want to know what specifically are you doing given all this? Right. I have a community of people that we want to be resilient, create buffers in our lives create a little distance from whatever might come. Now, given that, last time we talked, though, you were on the thread that there's this huge behind the scenes GCC realignment happening all around the Gulf. And I'd just love to get your perspective on it now, because at the time of this recording, I think just last night, the United States resumed bombing Iran. They did a little tit for tat. Who even knows what's really happening? The Strait of Hormuz effectively is closed again today with almost no ship crossings. What's going on? Have you changed or added to or fortified how you see things unfolding?
Yeah, I'm kind of at the stage where I ignore the noise. I think it's very theatrical with bounded escalations. So you get these moments where they try and trick us back in again into thinking that the world's over, and we're headed to World War III, or the deal's off, or Trump is blackmailed, and therefore Israel's forcing him to do. Everyone's got their own narrative at this stage. Like Trump is either playing 5D chess, or Iran has had a decisive victory, or Israel rules the world and is forcing Trump to do something. And everyone just sits in their narrative right now. What I believe is happening in my narrative, based upon markets, is that this was never a war that was going to exceed bounded escalations. Every time that Trump tacoed, it was decisively around the bond market. And so whenever the 30-year yield hit above 5%, which we're back at now, you ended up with a Taco Tuesday, some market manipulation, and a whole load of talks around we're not negotiating, and then everyone comes and sits at the table and negotiates. The reason for that is because I believe that no one wins from escalation. If you look at all the different parties around the table, and the New World Order, which was the long-term thesis that I think was happening, has really been set, and there's no reversing that trend. And as a reminder, China normalized between Iran and Saudi Arabia. There was an alliance between the Gulf countries and BRICS. And China is the number one purchaser of, all of the energy from all the different parties in the region. And so therefore it has significant leverage over the different parties. And I believe that there was a plan by factions of power on a transnational level that wants regional stability in the Middle East, wants the Middle East to become West Asia, which is predominantly held together by China and BRIC. And the rivalries that we see in the region are real, but not quite as real as most people would have them believe in terms of narrative. And so I think that the Gulf countries and Iran and a faction of power within the private sector of America that I call the financial industrial complex, the FIC, all want regional stability. And Iran at the end of this is going to need significant financing for all of its rebuild contracts. And I believe that financing is going to come from the Gulf via this. We've had a hint at it, a $300 billion fund, not reparations. And a fund means ownership, equity, and regional stability through shared vested interests. And I believe China and the Belt and Road Initiative will be part of that, as well as Iran trying to get as much as it can from the deal by unfreezing sanction funds, having the removal of sanctions, which would increase its revenue significantly, but it would also bring a bunch of oil back onto the market, which is your area of expertise at this stage. But at the same time, there has been damage in Gulf that needs to be rebuilt, but that's been really concentrated around US assets. And so I look at the region today and I zoom out and I see Iran normalized with the Gulf countries, China, that is the most important player in the region, and a very convenient. I got to be careful around this because I'm thinking about shared interests rather than conspiracy, because people think of it as a conspiracy. But when I see an operation that leads to the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, which creates urgency, that rhymes very much with the fall of the British Empire in the Suez Canal, and that kind of Egypt moment, which sets everything, redefines, renegotiates, force majeures contracts, reprices things, manufactures a crisis, which is a pattern we've seen time and time again. And with every crisis, you get concentration of power into fewer and fewer corporate interests. That's one operation. Then at the other side, you see convenient rebuild contracts that are going to happen in Iran and across the Gulf. And who invests in those rebuild contracts will set the world order. And I do actually believe that there will be a toll on the Strait of Hormuz. Now, it won't be as bombastic as Iran controls everything. It will be a partnership with Oman and also the vested interest across the Gulf. And so eventually we will see a structure. I don't know exactly what it looks like. But if you can charge on the Strait of Hormuz, then that questions every other strategic choke point. And that changes the Bretton Woods world order with, the American Navy protecting the trade routes. And if you think about it, the free trade routes was a function of the European and American empire. It was not allowing countries to use their strategic choke points to exert leverage over the European and American empire. The same with OPEC. OPEC, if you go back to the 73 embargo, and then you think about what was set up in 74, 75, you had the assassination of King Faisal, you had the petrodollar, and you had OPEC, which was set up to resist against the seven major oil, producers and companies across Europe and America. But what was the end result? The end result was the petrodollar. And what is the petrodollar? It is the pricing of oil in dollars. Now, that's fine. We can price oil in dollars, continue to do that. It's what you settle in that matters. And so more and more people have been settling in alternative currencies while pricing in dollars. And then you take those dollars that you sell your oil for, if you settle in dollars, and you purchase US treasuries. And so by purchasing US treasuries, you enter the Federal Reserve System. And then the Federal Reserve System produces a yield. And that yield is then spent back into the US equity market to have contracts like with Lockheed Martin, General Dynamic, Raytheon, and other companies that would then sell you weapons and put a base in your country. So now we don't have necessarily the bases or a renegotiated base across the region. We have the Gulf countries that have been moving away from purchasing treasuries and more purchasing equities. And what comes with equities? Voting rights and control. What were the Gulf countries investing in over the years? They were investing in AI and robotics infrastructure. They're the biggest investor in most of America's AI industry, alongside BlackRock and other financial institutions. Now, BlackRock also managed, had the CEO of Saudi Aramco join the board. We also had significant investment in Texas from the refining company that was a subsidiary of Saudi Aramco, that also could do the refining of the Venezuelan oil. We also had a significant build out with Qatar leading up to this, around the Golden Pass, which was 70% owned by Qatar Energy, 30% owned by Exxon. We had significant buildup of Chinese strategic petroleum reserves prior to this. We had very convenient regime changes in both Syria and Venezuela. Now, both of those have Iranian interests, Chinese interests, Russian interests, and American interests. Now, suddenly we got a regime change in Syria without much drama. That happens to be somebody deeply connected with the Gulf countries. Most people frame him as an Israeli puppet because he used to be a member of ISIS. But actually, he's a Gulf country and Turkish funded. I consider him a placeholder to stabilize Syria, and get rebuild contracts from the Gulf countries. We had the same in Venezuela. Like, China was preparing, China was moving. Russia and Iran kind of stepped down and bowed down. Maduro was regime changed, and it looked very effortless and easy prior to this. So we're seeing that the Western Hemisphere seems to be bounded around American interest and private corporate interest. We're seeing that China seems to be, with the Gulf countries and BRICS, resolving issues that look very chaotic, that suggest a multipolar world. We're also simultaneously seeing the removal of the foundation of the Japan carry trade as the Bank of Japan puts rates up. We're also seeing tension in the euro dollar market, the ability to create dollars outside the Federal Reserve System. Who got FX swap lines? It was UAE. So UAE is a really interesting one to watch. It gets strategic US bases destroyed. It's got an agreement with Israel that allows it to purchase Israeli companies and assets in the Abraham Accords. It leaves OPEC, which is the other half of the petrodollar. And it also gets an FX swap line, which allows it to deposit its own currency pegged to the dollar and create dollars in order to stabilize its regional system, led by a bunch of other Gulf countries that say we'd probably like the same. So this is the dismantling of the petrodollar. At the same time, as Iran brings all that oil onto market, at the moment it can only sell it to China, and it can sell it at a discount. Now it's not going to be at a discount if sanctions are removed, depending on the terms and the negotiation. And in what currency is it going to be priced in? Well, prior to this, Saudi priced 30% of its oil in the petro yuan. Also, the Bank for International Settlements left its project of a network of central bank digital currencies called Enbridge. And what was that project? It actually connected the Gulf central bank digital currencies with the Chinese central bank digital currencies. Now, we think of central bank digital currencies, and I do at the individual level, as surveillance. And we covered that deeply on our last podcast, or our last interview, rather. But from the nation level, what does it do? It allows you to circumvent SWIFT, and it allows you to operate outside the Federal Reserve System because it all clears on a blockchain. So what I think we're witnessing right now is the dismantlement in a managed transition by what I call the FIC, the financial industrial complex, of US hegemonic power and financial power into a multipolar world order, while we're told that we're driving towards the big World War III event of China and America going to war, which can never happen because the American military industrial complex cannot produce a weapon without China. So anyone saying we're going to World War III hasn't really thought through that. And I think everyone knows that. And so Russia gets Ukraine alongside whatever BlackRock and the FIC can asset strip out of the country. The MiG get to test weapons, which was the Palestinian laboratory and the Ukrainian laboratory. The FIC gets rebuild contracts, and the American interests and the global hegemon interests with the strategic choke points and ports and the petrodollar, it is being dismantled into these bounded escalations where every time we get a new agreement signed, we get closer to a non-US dominated world. You know, when Trump turns up in Beijing and you see Xi Jinping meeting with Tim Cook of Apple, the executives of Visa and MasterCard, Elon Musk of, well, SpaceX, whatever, Tesla, now what you want to call it. What do I see? I see the most important players meeting in one place, which is America is no longer a nation state. It is a private corporation. And all those private corporations were negotiating with their strategic partner, China, in order to make sure that they get the rare earth minerals that they need, that they get the cheap labor that they need, that they can still function the factories in China that they need. Because the only thing that's being rebuilt in America is AI, robotics, and data centers. And the rest requires China. And that's the transition that we're going through. And Trump is actually, to me, if you think he's an idiot, it's because I believe he's being fed instructions of what comes next and he doesn't know what comes next. And actually, he's servicing the private corporate transnational capital to perfection. But you think he works for Americans, so therefore it looks like a bumbling idiot that doesn't know what he's doing, that's losing a war. I think the loss was baked into the equation, and I think it was negotiated with China. And Trump is just your person for delivering this change in empire. So I'll park it there.
Thank you. Brilliant summary. I'm going to rotate the cube slightly. So February 28th, March 1st, depending on your timeline, where your dateline is, the United States and Israel do the decapitation strike. And within minutes, 5 minutes apparently, Iran's dialing back and they take out an extraordinary number of U.S. bases. I think probably one of the most comprehensive losses of assets in a short amount of time since any war I can think of, right? It was pretty profound, right? Including some really expensive, pricey radar systems. March 2nd, Ukraine suddenly decides to start dialing in long range and taking out Russian energy infrastructure assets. So, and I know we're all focused on the Strait of Hormuz, like they've got my focus, like everything's about that, and it's about the oil. I think it's a little bit more than the oil. I think it's the oil products, plus the sulfur, the, urea, the helium, et cetera. It's a lot of things. But it's now Financial Times even came out and said, oh, it's a known fact that, when Ukraine hit the Omsk refinery, 3,000 kilometers from their border, right? Russia's largest refinery. They hit it. They did that with American targeting help, right? Because, they have mobile air platforms and air defenses that get moved around. You have to know exactly where they are, and then you got to sort of thread the needles to get all the way in there. So the United States is clearly instrumental in shutting down the flows of oil from the Gulf, and also instrumental in really tuning up. I think Russia's out almost half of its refining capacity right now. They could fix it next week, but right now it's pretty bad. This feels like this is a 1-2 punch. I see them as they're the same event to me. This is somebody somewhere decided, you know what we should do, Simon? We should just really muck up the world's energy systems. So who wins and loses? China's the number one oil importer by far, but they have huge reserves, so they're able to sort of sit this out a bit. Europe is just going to get clobbered in this story. Absolutely clobbered. So then I think back to the old WEF stuff, which is like Western values will have been tested to the breaking point. And I can rotate this cube, and it looks to me both systematic and coordinated and also intentional This is designed, I think, to puncture the Western hegemony. I think to me, I feel like we're under attack, whether it's the refugees, culturally swamping areas. You put all these things in places. We don't have a border. We're not allowed to criticize Israel legally. It's just there's all these intentional things which conspire to this idea that I no longer belong to a nation, as it's been fed to me, through my schooling. And Europe is being systematically dismantled. And when the dust settles, I think we just go back to that 1940 chart of the technate of America. The United States sits on North America plus Venezuela, Greenland, Cuba. The rest sort of gets sorted out according to geography in the rest of the world.
Yeah, and that's been my long-term thesis before even this war started. So it's why I was I was less panicked and kind of sitting back a bit, because this is what I thought was where we were headed. And so Europe is absolutely being vassalized. America as a nation state is being more and more privatized to a full private takeover. The S&P 500 is moving towards 40 to 50% tech dominance. Most of the growth in the stock market and most of the growth in the GDP is building data centers for AI and robotics. Any thought of rebuilding a manufacturing base is just around, those semiconductor chips, resolving what's going to happen with Taiwan, in terms of China chip independence and America chip independence. That's not going to be a war from my calculations. There's no chance that there's ever going to be a war with Taiwan, around Taiwan. And I think Xi Jinping made that very clear, and we got lots of public, right before the meeting between Trump and Xi Jinping, and there was a cancellation of a $13 billion defense contract to Taiwan. There was the announcement from Trump, leave Taiwan. There was the announcement from Xi Jinping, Taiwan is all we care about, basically. And if you play nicely, then yeah, Elon, you'll be able to get your EVs, and Tim Cook, you'll be able to produce cheap iPhones. And military companies, stay away. We'll make sure you get the rare earths that you need. And we'll figure out what we're going to do with Taiwan. And basically, TSMC announced that it is going, as per the Biden policy, the CHIPS Act, is going to be building new chip manufacturing bases in America at the same time. So there's an interesting game happening there. Imagine you're Taiwan and you've got the Silicon Shield, and the only thing that protects you is that China and America need your chips. And you're finding out that those two players are talking. You create a game, as it were, that has a bit of a natural selection, which is what I think is happening right now. So on the China side, they've created the full stack between Huawei, DeepSeek, all of the stack that works without needing NVIDIA or anything. And they're building all of that capacity. America's doing the same. We've had the acquisition of Intel in terms of some of the shares. We've had the complete build out of AI data centers. We've had the CHIPS Act, and TSMC is going to be producing part of that. Now, some of the assets that would, that are essential in this supply chain are in Netherlands and South Korea. So Netherlands, you get a wealth tax all of a sudden that leads to turning the country into a stressed asset, much like the Dutch disease. We're getting the Dutch disease part 2 with wealth taxes. And South Korea and Japan were the two, South Korea, Japan, and India were the two most impacted by the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. I think this kind of leads to distressed asset acquisition, concentration into those key supply chains around AI and robotics. And what you'll get in Taiwan, I think, is a natural selection. Those that believe that China is the future of the empire or the future empire will kind of set up their relationships with China and gravitate towards helping that side. Those that believe, America, America's freedom and they're going to still prevail and all the tech is happening there, they'll kind of direct themselves over to America. And naturally, you'll end up with no assets in Taiwan. And in the next 5 years, chip independence between China and America. I think that's what is like one of the agreed negotiations. And in order to achieve that, I think it was said, right, you won't touch Taiwan. Uh, Russia gets Ukraine. You keep fighting to the last Ukrainian, and we'll bankrupt Europe in the process. And so Europe will have to print another $1 trillion through NATO to fund this war. It will stimulate our stock markets across UK, Israel, Germany, and America, the military industrial complex. And then eventually we'll transition to this technocratic Orwellian global control grid that seems to be built. Now, in the meantime, the FIC needs to hedge against the dollar dominance. And so what's the biggest, if you've got your entire financial center in America, the deepest liquidity stock markets, bond markets, everything, you set up a bunch of games that can lead to its destruction if you wanted to. But while it's powerful, you start hedging. So you set up lots of different alternative financial centers across Saudi, across UAE. You try and change you change Israel, you change Iran. And remember, the strategic tension between Iran and Israel was the justification for $10 trillion of money printing and war. When you take that away, you end up with a completely different, situation. How's the military going to make up for those lost profits? Well, if it's Central and South America, you can return back there. Give it Europe. Also give it a new surveillance industry, civil unrest in America and Europe. Build out the privatized police and deportation systems. Build out the Palantir, pre-crime arrests and fill up the prisons. We'll build more prisons. America has the highest incarceration rate in the world right now, 2 million incarcerations. This is because GEO Group and Core Civic get paid per deportation and get paid per imprisonment. So the incentives are all aligned in terms of that. So I do think this is the systemic asset stripping of America in order to transition the world to a multipolar order, using war as a mechanism to get leverage and negotiation into that multipolar world order, while a global control grid between China and the technical industrial complex TIC is being built out. And energy was the way of resetting that map. Close the Strait of Hormuz, renegotiate all the energy routes, and use the MIC in order to, via the proxies, Ukraine and Israel, in order to get maximum leverage into these negotiations of the new world order that's going to come from whatever is signed with Iran marks the new world order. Who invests? Who rebuilds? What happens with the Strait of Hormuz? What happens to Israel? And then obviously what happens in Ukraine, Russia, and what happens to Taiwan and China. And I think those have all been agreed, and we're moving towards it with bounded escalations in order to try and get more leverage in these big changes.
Now, you know this better than anybody, but when you start peeling back how our money system works, currency systems, not really money, but currency, how it actually functions, right? So we just print it out of thin air, and then we have, it's actually, every unit of currency is backed by an offsetting amount of debt somewhere in the system. It's either that debt is either an asset on the central bank's balance sheet, or it's, in a bank somewhere, but that's it. We create debt and you get more of this currency. And so that system clearly can't operate forever. I don't know when it's going to break, but objectively, you look at it, you go, oh, there's a huge mismatch between claims, which we'll call all the units of currency and associated debt, and actually what the global economy can actually produce. Unless we have some exciting new thing where where information suddenly has value. We've created this value out of nothing. Ex nihilo. Look, we ran some models and now this data has value, right? But where value used to come from was land, food, resources, right? So if you could just study routes and resources, as Michael Jan said, you could pretty well understand how the world sorted itself out. That was what the whole Suez scrap was about. It's like, you know, the British Empire had all these flows coming in because they controlled routes and resources. And now we're supposed to believe there's this whole new thing called information, which is just as valuable as that old stuff. And I think they're trying to make that swap. But I submit to you that underneath that, these people are smarter than us, or as smart, however you want to look at it. But they have to know that the fiat currency system has an expiry date on it. Might not be immediate, but it's clearly being expanded at an exponential rate faster than the economy could ever possibly expand. So how do you begin to square that? Because it means what we think of as what's the role of money. It used to be to apportion economic activity, but now it's more used for power and control. It feels to me like they're racing against a clock with all this stuff, and they want to slap us into something, stable coins, CBDCs, something. But I feel like they're kind of pawing around for a solution because they can add the numbers up as well as I can. The fiat system is entering what I would call the terminal phase at this point in time. And by the way, just to throw a little something on top of that, everybody knows now that the United States is at peak oil, and we'll soon have to recognize we're at peak gas as well. And this is the part that I can't quite square up, because if you have all these brilliant data centers, man, they're gas gobblers, right? And you know that you're going to be going down in gas production over time, but you need these new control things to last forever. Like, if you knew that, the only rational response would be to start slapping in nuclear plants as fast as you could. And we're not doing that. So I feel like there's something I'm missing in this story. They have to know all this.
I think it's important to define what the end of the fiat currency system is. I certainly think we're hitting an age where we're going to question dollar dominance. But fiat currency just rolls over. And so it always it just means that a new currency is used, or a new order, or a new mechanism for tying those currencies together. But I don't think it ends fiat currency. And so let's look at the dominant order right now. So we had the removal of the gold standard 71. We had the creation of the petrodollar. And the arrangement depended upon everybody purchasing US treasuries so that America could roll over its debt. We're now at that $40 trillion mark. So the question is, can America roll over its debt? Well, what tension do we have there? Well, the first thing is that foreign central banks have started to reduce their treasury reserves, and they've increased their gold reserves, and that's a global trend. But general private capital is still purchasing treasuries. Now, it's going towards a shorter expiration date. So less people are willing to lend to the US government for 30 years, but there's still the most liquid market out there compared to the other treasury, compared to the other bonds. Less are willing to lend. It's still pretty liquid in the 10-year. But more and more is moving over to short term, including the US government itself. And so more and more of the auctions are being done at the shorter dated treasuries, which means that it has to continually roll over, but people are only willing to lend to the US government for so long. So what are the sources of that? Well, one of the sources of that is borrowing money at 0% from the Bank of Japan. Now that's not there anymore. So we have this unwinding of that carry trade. Now, what were they doing with that carry trade? Well, the largest foreign lender to the US government is Cayman Island. We know that Cayman Island is just it's not the actual economy. It's a vehicle for all the hedgies. And they were borrowing from the carry trade in order to be 50x leverage, 100x leverage on the basis trade by participating in these auctions. And 40 to 50% of those treasury auctions were just someone trying to clip value out using leverage, using the Japan carry trade. So then you have another thing. What if other countries and sovereign wealth funds started trying to sell their treasuries? Well, that's when you get the UAE situation. Instead, you say, don't sell your treasuries, don't sell your shares. We don't want you to crash our stock market. Just deposit some of your currency on deposit and we'll give you an FX swap line. So you create the dollars. And then you can buy the treasuries with the dollars that you get to create. So now they're outsourcing the dollar creation mechanism and the purchase of treasuries and the clear to other countries. So what's left? Well, the left is, as long as the US banking system and the global banking system is willing to use treasuries as collateral, then it can continue, then the dollar can continue to be rolled over. At the moment, the indications are that the banking system is still willing to use the dollar as collateral. And the reason for that is because they believe that the Fed will purchase the treasuries and increase their balance sheet. So then you come back to, right, so everything's on the Fed. Now, the Fed right now is, if anyone starts selling their treasuries, we end up with these spikes in the yield on the 30-year, which then breaks the real estate market, because then you get mortgages at 7% and no one can roll over their debt at these expensive rates. So you've got stress there, and then you've got that connected to the commercial real estate market. What about on the other sides of stress? Well, we know that the banking system was correlated slightly to the build out of AI through the private credit markets. And so you've got these private credit market redemption issues. It doesn't feel systemic into banking yet, because they're just doing write downs and making the retail investor lose their money and restricting redemptions. But how much of that money was lent from the banks with a very similar system to the 2008, where no one really knows what the end loan in that private credit and whether it went to the AI data centers and what that means. So we've got this Lego construct there that's kind of fragile as well. And if you think about the narrative, if you break the private credit market or the commercial real estate market, you then force the too big to fail narrative, because the bank will always be bailed out because it has to be, it is the dollar. And so that's how you can force the Fed into a bailout, increase its balance sheet. Then you need an acceptable narrative. What's that acceptable narrative? Well, it's building right now. We need to win the AI arms race. If China wins, they win. And so you've got private credit that's funding out these data centers connected to the banking system, which then feeds back into commercial real estate issues. Then you've got the AI narrative. We have to win. And really, it's all dependent upon the Fed in stress doing quantitative easing. And so really right now, the regime change that happened at the Fed with Kevin Walsh is the entire game. It's what will the Fed do? And the foreign central banks are hedging away from it. And can they create a new mechanism for rolling over their debt? Well, one strategy, and we don't know if it will work, is that if the banking system goes through stress, you just replace it with a CBDC. You also create private stable coins backed by US debt. And you push those two different markets. Both of those are going into legislation right now. And both of them have implications in that they are now programmable money. One way you could also do this is you could create a massive productivity increase through artificial intelligence that is somewhat disinflationary, that offsets this. But the side effect of that is you create lots more unemployment. And so if you're creating lots more unemployment, you obviously can't tell people that. But you could use AI to push the price of goods down and down and down and down. And at the same time, as the price of goods are going down and down and down through this AI productivity increase, it's leading to more unemployment. But who's actually benefiting from all that money printing? Well, it's those that own the AI data centers, those that own the AI infrastructure. So what you're doing is you're accelerating the K-shaped economy. the concentration of wealth upwards to those that own this whole AI ecosystem, that the entire bond market is being used via these these different things to build these data centers. So when you plug all that together, what do you end up with? Well, you end up with most likely a universal basic income in an environment of goods decreasing in value, but all the wealth concentrating to those that own the assets. And so what are you doing? You're basically saying, well, if all the wealth is concentrating upwards, and now 92% of the US stock market is owned and controlled by 10%, what are we going to do when people can't afford to consume? Well, you give them a universal basic income. So you give them just enough in order to manage the consumption and the profits of the concentration of wealth. And you make it programmable, you reward them, and you back it by treasuries. So to me, there is a game plan of this CBDC. And by the way, they just implemented an act saying that there'll be no CBDC in America, but they already have one. It's called Fed
Right.
Now, as a wholesale central bank digital currency. But it does give a date and a head start to the stablecoin issuers, which is the privatization into the technical industrial complex. And there's also legislation called the Genius Act that says the Fed can use their reserves to issue a stablecoin. And there's also Clarity Act that says we'll give an advantage to the banks over, in this market, because if you've got a banking license, you can pay the yield. So plug all of that together, and I see a slow, steady movement towards, trying to roll over the dollar system for as long as possible, back it by the debt, make the American people the bag holders, reform accordingly, and asset strip and invest into multipolarity. If you look at BlackRock, approximately 50% of the ETFs are foreign controlled capital now. That's how they control the capital flows, via ETFs. Foreign capital, and $70 trillion of US assets are foreign owned now. So America is foreign controlled, and the intermediary between that capital is the Fed. And the only people you can dump the debt on is the American people. And so what do? You vassalize Europe, you asset strip the assets, you push everything into the stock market, you roll over the debt, and then you use those assets to build out into a multipolar world. And that's the only game. You roll over the debt and you asset strip for as long as it works. And it works. Here's the conditions that it works. As long as the banks are willing to use treasuries as collateral, and the growth rate of the economy is bigger than the average cost on the debt. Right now, the average cost on the debt is 3.3%. If you can't beat 3.3%, then you're asking, you got to have the growth rate at a greater rate than the average cost on the debt. And the only way to fix that is get the average cost on the debt down. So you regime change the Fed, try and have a policy of lower interest rates and roll over the debt short term. And then you try and manage the longer term rates by the Fed purchasing the bonds, increase their balance sheet. And the Fed has 100% control over whether it does that. And so, yeah, you're right. We're in that game, but as long as you can grow above the 3.3%, now that growth doesn't need to be any reflection on what's good for the American people. It could be print money and invest in wars. It could be print money and build data centers. It could be create more financialization and securitization and tokenization and speculation and degenerate gambling. As long as it produces the growth, it doesn't matter who it benefits. As long as you can get the growth, the game continues. And so that's kind of where I think we are, the fiscal dominance, which is print to stimulate, and then stimulate to stimulate the stocks, and concentrate wealth upwards. And then when it all goes down, just give them a UBI, and we'll create programmable money.
So, I have multiple things to comment on that. First, though, about the 3.3%. Also, the U.S. government right now is deficit spending at, I don't know, 6-7%, right? So of GDP. So doesn't that have to sort of be wrapped in there? Is because
Yeah,
that's just
absolutely. I mean,
accumulating.
yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, if America entered into a recession or a stock market crash, anything that reduced tax income right now, and you reverse, and you increase the cost of the debt, so the rates continue to go up, and you're rolling over at higher and higher rates, which is the current situation, and the interest on the debt is creating a doom loop, where the interest on
Mm-hmm.
the debt means you need to roll over more debt, which means you need to sell more treasuries, which is weakening the dollar, and just all of this impossible mission right now. The world reserve currency is dependent upon that twin trade deficit and tax deficit. Um, if you end up in a situation where the deficit goes 7%, 8%, 10%, 12%, then you're in the doom loop cycle. When that will happen, when that will happen is anyone's guess. But at the moment, America's still able to roll over at higher rates, and this is becoming very obvious to foreign central banks. So they're selling their treasuries and they're hedging.
Well, so maybe it gets overplayed a lot, but for some reason Rome fell, right? And one of the factors that's slated often is, well, they did a little military overreach, right? They just overspent. Plus, they had bad leaders and corrupt politicians. Usual, let's say, symphony of things that tend to show up towards the end of empire. I think it's just a normal part of the metronome of humanity. But the NDAA Trump is proposing, and it looks like it's getting seriously considered, to increase our military expenditures from already punishing $900 billion to $1.5 trillion per year, with, of course, Section 219 welding us into Israel, who will just keep us perpetually. They're so good at starting wars. They'll get us. Trust me, we're in a forever war. Those two things happen in a very, very expensive forever war. This sounds like a recipe for breaking the bank. And again, I look at this as, if I wanted to intentionally destroy my country, I would be doing that exactly. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, but I don't think Israel has the ability to hinge a forever war anymore because China's risen,
Mm.
and China's the most important country in the region. And do you think China's okay with Israel being a US military proxy to destroy the region and fuel the US stock market forever war? I don't think so. And
Mm.
so Israel
That's
will be
hopeful.
regime changed. Yeah. I mean, Israel is just a mick node. Their job is to create more profits for the US military. The Israeli stock market is a military stock market, the US, the UK, the German, and the French. And their job is to facilitate the money laundering. Um, Now, they represent the MiG faction of power, which is aligned with the deep state, which is the MI6 CIA Mossad faction. Um, and and But financial, what's the competing power around there is the financial power. The financial power are aligned with the Gulf countries. Every single deal that the FIC does is with the Gulf sovereign wealth funds. Now, Saudi has said until there is a Palestinian state, there'll be no normalization in the region. China has said Iran and Saudi have normalized. Iran, Pakistan, Turkey, Egypt, and likely funded by Saudi will probably have their new defense pact. But the most important part of this is that China is creating new rails across the region with UAE, with Saudi, with Iran, with the GCC, with the BRICS corridors. So US doesn't dominate the game anymore. And so US is, I believe, managing its exit. And Israel will probably just be privatized like America was. And in fact, that's happening. The number of IPOs that are happening in Israel this year and the stock market in Israel is at record highs. More and more of the national assets are being privatized, and UAE and India are buying them.
Well, it's fascinating to see how many world leader showed up to Khomeini's morning processions there in Tehran. It was quite surprising to me, including Saudi. I wasn't expecting that.
Yeah. Again, when you're managing such a big change in the world, regional. So if the goal is to turn Iran into Syria, then I think things would be done differently. The goal, I think, is to sustain the IRGC, take out those which I think has already happened that were not on board with China's vision and the normalization between Iran and Saudi Arabia, but end up with the same people that were negotiating, before the war, are the same people negotiating during the war, and will be the same people negotiating after the war, and none of them died. The only ones that died were the ones that probably wouldn't be on board with such a new regional stability vision. And what I see across the region is the replacement of proxies with state armies. You saw that in Yemen, when the Houthis signed an agreement with Saudi Arabia. Yes, we get bounded escalation, but directionally, Iran allowed Houthis to continue to sign an agreement, and that will probably go into a political process to have Houthis integrated into the state political process and army. We saw the same in Syria. We saw a tit for tat between Saudi and UAE. I call good cop, bad cop. So at the same time as Saudi getting dominance and signing agree with the Houthis over Yemen, we saw UAE get jurisdiction over their ports in Somaliland. Now, everyone was reporting it as Israel, but it's UAE that owns those ports, not Israel. And Israel, recognized Somaliland, which was the resolution between Turkey's strategic assets in Somalia and UAE's strategic ports. So why are we getting all of these different port assets being resolved one by one? And everyone's just focusing on Israel's winning the game, Israel controls America, Israel's Greater Israel project. I think they want you to believe that, because Israel's at its weakest moment right now. And we're also starting to see that, the leftover from the agreement was Lebanon. Hezbollah, is being allowed to go at it with Israel, which is weakening each other. So you're getting a weaker Israel on the ground invasions and a weaker Hezbollah from the air bombardments. Sadly, civilians need to die in that process because Israel always goes for civilian target. But that's what they do when they're trying to spark a reaction. But now you get an agreement between Israel and the Lebanese government. The Lebanese government is a proxy for American interests. Hezbollah has always been supported by Iran. And then you have the Israeli part that they've now occupied and they'll be using for leverage in whatever the new order looks like at the end of it. And so then you have one of the biggest, most impacted was Iraq. So to me, when I look around the map, I see long-term forever war issues being resolved. And I see everyone deciding who's going to control what ports. And now with whatever comes out of the Strait of Hormuz will set the order for the region. I'm very positive amongst the carnage that this is the end of the US forever war. And it's because Israel, who is a proxy for the US military, while people might try to say it's Israel, Israel's a proxy as well. They have their own lobby process. They have their own power structure. If you think Netanyahu's in charge of the world, he works for his power, which is the military lobbies. That's his stock market as well. And so these military nodes are saying, well, the Middle East was really profitable for us for a long time. If we're moving to regional stability and rebuild, we want as much of that as possible. But you need to give us a new war zone. So make sure you don't end Europe. Make sure you escalate in Central and South America. Make sure you create civil unrest because we need to make up for lost profits if we're leaving here. We're going to get some defense agreements, but it looks like China and Russia might be taking care of that, and Turkey and Egypt and various other things. So, yeah, to me, I'm very positive about where this is going. This is the dismantlement of Israel as a MIC node in the region. And it looks like they're controlling the game, but that's just a propaganda that they need you to believe. Because the Epstein blackmail networks were private corporate power blackmail networks.
Mm-hmm.
And Mossad and Israel was just a node to create plausible deniability. I mean, that if you think that Israel, America doing a genocide is not in line with how it's always acted, the British Empire and American Empire have done them, but they do them via proxies. So Israel is a perfect representation of how the British and American Empire have always acted. This isn't like, you don't need to blackmail American private corporate interest and the MIC to profit from war. This is what props up its stock market. This is what rolls over its debt. That's not something you need to blackmail. That's something that already functions. But it's a nice, plausible deniability story if you get all the Americans to believe we wouldn't do this. This isn't us, it's them. And now we're going to break free from them. And none of this would have ever happened if it wasn't for them. It's a nice story if you can manage it that way.
Well, so skipping back then to this whole idea that it's asset stripping, consolidation, a capital techno elite, and then everybody else getting UBI in that sweep. What you're describing sounds like communism just with better tools.
I think communism means that the government's in charge, and the government's not in charge. The private sector's in charge.
I think of communism as a very tiny technocratic elite who believe they have the right, if not the obligation, to tell everybody else what to do, which is mostly live as poorly as possible so that they can live as richly as possible.
Yeah, so definitionally, I don't think that fits into the definition of communism. The way that China operates is the government's in charge, but then they have capitalism underneath it. The way that America and the West operates is that the private sector's in charge and they have government underneath it, and you just pay for them, and you just buy them, and you lobby them. Those are the two governing systems of the two powers at the moment, which is, Fick Mick Tick in the West and China in the East. Now, what I think you have in America and the rest of the West right now is socialism for the private corporations and capitalism for everyone else. And so you socialize the losses and privatize the gains. So you dump the debt on the American people and they pay the inflation. You make them believe they've got capitalism when you have a central banking system that's a Ponzi scheme. And then they justify capitalism because they don't realize that the large multinational corporate that has the revolving door to the government and rolls over the Ponzi scheme is actually socialism. Because the bank bailout was socialism. The COVID bailout was socialism. And so the American system at the highest level of power is socialism, with everyone else having capitalism. But the capitalism is rigged against them because they don't have the revolving door. That's what we have in the West. I don't see any communism. I do see a private technocratic control grid. And remember, the Federal Reserve is a private company owned by the bank. And so I don't see the government winning here. I see the government being asset stripped and everyone else being controlled by the private sector.
When I use something like communism, I'm thinking about it's not the political architecture of it. It's how it operates in principle, which is totalitarian, and with this conceit that I think has been proven wrong all through history, which is that a small number of people can sort of decide, things and about how you should live, what you should believe, how you dress, what you can say, what you can't say, what you do, But basically, it's all about controlling from the moment you're born till you die, harvesting as many units of usable things for the people up the chain. And so that's how here's why this is important to me. AI is pretty powerful, but we can talk about how powerful you think it is, but I believe that the world economy is a complex system. I believe that that to really have that sustainable flow of stuff going to the top, you need millions of independent agents out there making independent decisions in that complex thing, with incentives sort of being the shaping force around all that. I think they can control all this because I think they're control freaks. I think you got your Hariris and they're just like, oh, well, I've God in a box, and now we can finally administer all of this like we always wanted to, and it's going to be perfect. Chef's kiss. I think they're going to fail because I think they do not fundamentally appreciate or understand how complex systems work. Nobody does. They're basically beyond the human wetware. But I think they can really control it this time. I don't. So that's why I have a farm. And that's why I have as many of my assets outside of that system as possible. And that's why the number one thing I'm guarding jealously right now is my freedom of thought, my ability to operate independently, because I don't want to have my outcomes be completely tethered to their ship, because there's just a non-zero chance that ship just sinks at some point. For the oldest reason in the book, it's the Tower of Babel. We thought we got a little ahead of ourselves. Now, this time we deserve a seat at the table with God. We can rewrite the instructions of life itself. We got it because our technology is our tower, right? And so we've got it. It's all hitched there. Dude, we're one coronal mass ejection away from that whole thing being proven pretty false. We are one piece of malicious code that AI generates for some reason, who knows why, that escapes and takes all our systems down. I mean, it's perilous to me to put all of our faith in that technology, because you should probably have a redundant system where people still know how to do things without the box.
Yeah, you should definitely have a redundancy set up. So I define that as authoritarianism and centralization. And whether the government is the centralizing force, or the central bank is the centralizing force, or the monarchy is the centralizing force. And under a democracy, it means that the company becomes the centralizing force, because you just buy the democracy, which is where we are right now. And so one's overt and the other's covert. And so if you're in China, you know who's in charge, who's authoritarian, and you know what the rules are around freedom of speech and what you can and can't talk about. At the moment, that is in America and across the West, but it's done via a covert mechanism, which is algorithms, which is the private sector, which is a few smaller and smaller asset managers and complexes that control those algorithms. If you think that there's freedom of speech right now, there's kind of a couple of, I like to think about it when you look at the West and the state of things right now. You have those that are kind of just really in dire debt, that are really in a bad position. They have, but they're able to talk about what they want because they can't influence the system. And all they're doing is they're talking into social media and they're building their social credit score. They want to know what your real beliefs are. It used to be a mission of censorship. So we had like the Snowden revelations and you get deplatformed. That era is over now. It's like, you talk about whatever you want, but we'll put you in a box and we'll make you a radicalized version of yourself. We'll give you freedom of speech, but not freedom of reach. And so if you say what we want you to say, then the algorithm will boost your content. If you become more of what we want you to become, a radicalized version of yourself, we'll feed you more and more content that makes you believe that your version of the world is the correct version of the world. And we'll keep feeding you and feeding you and feeding you until you really are radicalized, into whatever it is, whether it's all right, whether it's radical left, whether it's, anti-Islam, whether it's anti-Judaism, whatever it may be. Pick your pill. And then they push you into an influencer algorithm so that you become the most radicalized version of you. And they kind of boost these people that represent each faction, and you get fed their content. That's kind of like where we are right now. So they don't mind you talking, but they are weaponizing your speech. Have it be named. That's not freedom of speech. You don't get the reach, and you're building your social credit score. Then you have the people that are captured by the system. Now, their wealth depends upon the preservation of the system. You're seeing this across generations. You have a big divide between boomers and Gen X right now, where the young people feel that the old people have got all the real estate, they got all the stocks, and they're just telling them to work harder. And it will be, I had to work hard. Why can't you work hard? You're a whinger, And so you have that divisional, and they start for, yeah, it's all right for you. You were able to buy property when it was this price, and you got all the pension, and you got all the stocks, and you're sat on millions, and you just want the system to continue working so you can retire. But I can't buy, you got these divisional things as a result of the K-shaped economy. They don't mind people that are captured by the system because their wealth is dependent upon the preservation of the current system. You see it right now, like the China's real estate market has really corrected, and people are celebrating housing is more affordable in China. In America, that's like, oh, the real estate market's crashed, their system's over, and the young people are saying, crash this damn shit. I want to buy a house. I want to buy stock. Can you just crash these markets already and get this stuff over with? So they don't mind people that are captured by the system where their wealth is preserved, because they don't talk out against the system. What they don't want is the people that are outside the system that you talked about. They've built their autonomy and freedom. They own assets that are captured by the system. And they're wealthy enough to actually change the system. Like, they can lobby, they can have audience, they can have message, they can actually affect change with money and invest in things. They're kind of driving these are the people they don't want, and the system doesn't want. And so whether you call that communism or not, I just say, I look across the entire history of monarchies, capitalism, communism, whether the government's in charge, whether the central bank's in charge, whether a few companies are in charge, whether a king or queen in charge, it's always the same thing. The wealthy end up in charge, and they use their wealth in order to control power and buy power and the choke points. And so we're kind of fed into these ideologies, which I just reject. There is just, is this working or is this not working? And if you want to call me a radical left communist socialist, or you want to call me a free market libertarian, I reject those labels, because I can see a version of those that don't work. They none of them work. In fact, it's just, the matrix. I like what there was a country I was looking at recently called the Kingdom of Bhutan. And they reject the matrix of gross domestic product, because you can rig the game, right? Print money, invest it in the stock market, create war, and you stimulate your stock market, and you can stimulate growth. Now, you may have killed everyone. However, it's still GDP, it's growth. And they said, well, we're going to use gross happiness index. And they're measuring their success based upon how many people are happy. And the majority of people are happy, and it leads to different policy. And so now the capitalist or the Austrian economist would have said, well, you leave that all to the market, and GDP is GDP no matter what. So I think we've been fed a bunch of BS, and I know we have, because I look at who funded all the universities and whose interest it was to preserve Keynesianism, Austrian economics, monetarism. Milton Friedman justified inflation and money printing. Keynesianism justified money printing and government spending. Austrians justified the gold standard, and the gold standard ended up being captured by the banking system in order to control it. And so all of those, are just justifications for a faction of power. We just need to, I think, look across a country and say, are these things working? And I look across a bunch of places right now and say, no, a lot of stuff's not working, whether you call it communism or capitalism.
Well, that's absolutely true. And that generational divide is pretty real because, boomers who I'm right at, depends who's counting. I'm either X or boomer. But my critique is that when you have a 40-year declining interest rate tailwind, it's easy to be a genius, right? And people who are starting to form households today are in the exact opposite environment. They're in a rising interest rate environment. So totally different landscape just economically, 100%. And these people today, these poor kids, are starting out with everything as expensive as it's ever been. I'm not saying the stock market's kind of expensive. It's more expensive than it's ever been in history when you look across all the measures. The Buffett indicator, PE, forward sales, doesn't matter. Like you add them all up. So it's not just kind of pricey. It's stupid expensive. Housing, same thing. And then, of course, you see property taxes going up and you got, insurance just skyrocketing across the board. It's clearly not working for more and more people. But that cut line, poverty used to be way down there. And I think, the poverty line, if you live in a city, it's six figures now. Poverty meaning you can't square all those circles in your budget and still have money left over to begin to create buffers for yourself over time. Like that cut line is pretty high, and it's going to get higher. The Fed is already printing. They've already printed $200 billion in the last 6 months. They're back to expanding their balance sheet, reserve balance management. I'm sorry. I misspoke. It's not QE. It's RBM. Right?
Yeah,
And then it'll be a TALF, still whatever acronym they need next. I look at this though, and it feels to me like it's becoming more and more and more untenable for more and more people, just from inflation alone, but also from the capture dynamics that have happened, where Jim Kunstler put it best. I think our companies have lost the plot line, and they openly run rackets on everybody. Healthcare is a racket. Predatory pricing in hospitals, a racket. Insurance, a complete racket, right? On and on and on. And because of that, it almost feels like Trump is this crowning cherry on the sundae where he's just doing an open cash grab for his family. It's like this last act of like massive grifting. It just feels like we're at that stage where, how did George Washington put it? The last official act of any government is to loot the treasury. Well, we don't have an effective government. It just feels like everybody's in a looting operation right now. And that's how it feels. And it feels out of control. And those things tend not to be durable. What are your thoughts?
I completely agree with everything that you said there. It's just, we've hit a stage where everyone's starting to question the system, understand the system, and they don't like what they see. And I think Trump is a perfect representation of where we are right now, which is, if you want to call me Trump derangement syndrome, I've got Biden derangement syndrome, Clinton derangement syndrome, Trump derangement syndrome, Keir Starmer derangement syndrome. Like, just give me a leader that looks like a leader, then is not a puppet that's extracting wealth. And I could say everything I say about Trump, I could say about Biden and the laptop and the deals with China and the just complete extraction and just not doing what the label said. And I think everyone's come to realize that we're being missold about everything, and people are getting incredibly frustrated now. And Trump is just the perfect representation of that crypto scamming, like billions of dollars of extraction, doing deals with the Gulf countries while raging wars, and just do everything is the opposite of the narrative. And quite frankly, a cult leader. Like, if you're still in the MAGA cult, you are a product, and your ideology is not your ideology. It was downloaded like an operating system through the media
Exactly.
into your brain. Like, I can look at you from one tweet and probably tell you 25 different things about you, what you watch, who you like, what type. And that's because you can look at someone and you can just look at one tweet and you can draw these are the 25 other things that have been downloaded into your brain, you know. And that's kind of the fact that you can take a step back and predict that means that these are not our thoughts, these are not our ideologies, and we are being brainwashed into a product. We are being manufactured, and we need to get back to our critical thinking, which means, and getting back to the theme, you know, I think the real battle is this centralization versus decentralization. That's the real battle. Whether it's centralization into the Chinese Communist Party, or centralization into BlackRock, or centralization into a Gulf monarchy, or whatever it may be. We are directionally heading towards peak centralization, not peak prosperity. And peak prosperity comes from us taking agency and being more decentralized. You know, taking all of those grifts. We've all come to the realization that we're being poisoned so that we become a subscription service, for therapy, unhealthy drugs, treatment, like, and we can see that we're all figuring that out. You take any area of expertise, and someone will tell you, this food's not good. If someone's an expert in that area, they'll tell you how rigged the system is. I can tell you how rigged the system is in my game. Like, Trump was a crypto grifter, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of where we are right now. So you need to get to that realization. And while the AI is telling you what to think, we need to have our own decentralized AI that actually enhances our productivity, hosted on our own environment, that's not algorithmically driving us in the direction that the centralizing power wants us to go towards. And that happens across money, that happens across every part of the, wealth, health, and mindset. And it's kind of exhausting and overwhelming, which is not what I want to leave people with. But at the very end, you can draw this down to some pretty fundamental things. That pretty much everything we've been told is a lie. So you need to relearn and unlearn what you've learned, that was installed into you. And then you need to start experimenting and get more agencies. We do know that the way that the economy is set up right now is that the asset holder is the only one that's going to be able to beat the inflation. And so then you have to pick your asset. Is this asset helping, centralization, or is it not? And you're not going to get this 100%, because and then you start thinking, well, do I want a full opt out? I don't think opting out of AI is a reasonable solution, unless you've got your own ranch and your own environment and you can just completely opt out. I don't think that's most people. So you have to use AI to be more productive, to play in the game. So what type of AI should I be using? Interestingly, this whole China thing, they've released everything open source, which is the opposite of what we thought would have happened, because, well, not really. They released it open source because they want to use AI to take out all the employment issues and the demographic issues, and build their own manufacturing base. So it makes sense it would be open source. The American companies investing trillions in capex that will all be useless in 3 years, that they need to refinance again to get the next wave of chips. And so that's why they're all issuing stocks like crazy at these valuations, raising as much debt as they can while they still can, and using podcasts in order to push a media narrative, that that we're in the AI arms race and you need to be patriotic and support the American ecosystem. And if you don't buy this share now, you're not a real American. You're a Chinese communist. So all of these things you kind of get your head around. But yeah, the valuation, there's no market. This isn't a stock market. Like, this is a function of the Federal Reserve money printer, ETF capital flows through passive investments, where people are just saying, I'll invest $1,000 a month through my pension, and you invest and do whatever. and a captured media that is no longer saying let's price this based upon price per earnings or earnings per share or anything like that. That's gone. This is just, will the money printer continue? Is the narrative something that we can push? And is the passive flow still going to come in? As long as those goes, then market goes up. And anytime it cracks and makes things more reasonable, bailout comes in. Like, socialize the losses, privatize the gains. This ain't a market. Like, if you think that this is a market, like you might as well just try and figure out what BlackRock, the Federal Reserve, the Bank for International Settlements, the Bank of Japan, and PBOC are going to do. And then if you can predict that, then that's will tell you what's going on.
They're going to print more. So, I mean, it's all about this narrative structure, though. So I've been working on a theory for a while, which I think it's almost a theory, maybe a hypothesis. Back it up. So this happened during COVID, right? So we heard about, they had these nudge units out there and they wanted to combat this thing called vaccine hesitancy, and they ran focus groups, and then they started doing all this stuff, and they were using social media algorithms to try things out at the speed of light and, corral people and all that, ostensibly for public health. But really what they wanted to get this mRNA jab in as many arms as possible, as fast as possible, right? And they overrode all kinds of things to do that. Now, there's a darker story under all of that, but right now I just want to talk about the power of their tools to do that was so good that I was at a bowling alley the other day and there's somebody wearing a mask years after the fact. Like they took a bullet right to the head of whatever this machine is, right? And for a while, and I went to No Kings rallies with my wife, and we went to the Elons and Nazi rallies just because I had to feel the vibe personally, right? And these people, very earnest, very passionate, but if you scratched at their belief systems, you hit primer right away. There was no deeper paint layer. They had no idea why they thought what they thought, but they were regurgitating it. And so I was like, okay, I formed some judgments about lefties. And then I watched the whole thing happen to the right equally, right? Around all kinds of things, becoming pro-war all of a sudden. And so here's the thing. These were normally, on the left, we had all these crunchy people. I live in a semi-crunchy area. We have ex-hippies here, and they were all anti-vaxxers until COVID. And so they had this entire belief system that you can't trust pharma suddenly switch with no intervening cognitive dissonance. There was no struggle session. They believed this and then that. And I don't, from a psychological standpoint, I don't get it. Right. And I've watched the right do the same thing. No intervening struggle session. They just have this new belief system downloaded, installed, plug and play. How does this, are we witnessing that there's that sort of the Milgram experiments got improved over time? And we're now seeing, I feel like we're in a weaponized mind control program right now. And it's darn scary how effective it is. It's all about their ability to shape narrative is astonishing.
Yeah, it's incredibly sophisticated, and we don't really need to be if you want to talk about what's happening today, then you have to be a conspiracy theorist. But if you want to talk about what has already happened, then we've got all the evidence we need that what they're doing today is what they've always already done. And so you can look at whether it's Operation Mockingbird, where the CIA, installed their own people in the media, in Fox and CNN. Whether it's they created the word conspiracy theory so that when you talk about it, you're mockingbird. Whether it's look at, to me, like the one that I remember the most and the best is we were being told, I would watch the news and there would be a death counter every single day during the lockdown. And we would have this counter, almost like a countdown of how many people are dying, and it would be in the corner of the screen, and there'd be more and more people dying every second. And then we were just being fed, look what's happening in Italy, look what's happening in these different places. And it was really traumatizing, like the footage. And, we were fed with all of these, someone not being able to get into their grandma and, and then they were making the connections that if we don't inject ourselves with this and we don't social distance and we don't wear a mask, then we're killing our grandma. And so they radicalized us. And these are psychological operations. Depending on, whatever your belief is, leave it, just park it there. We already, Tulsi Gabbard has released the documents to say that Fauci was investing in bioweapons that ended up in the Wuhan lab. So whether you believe it was manufactured, real, or whatever, it was weaponized and it was created, and we know that. And so, who was that weaponized for? Well, you come to your own conclusion. We don't need to do that. But what I think is really interesting is I remember the day so well that we were being pushed into, like, I think it was probably the fifth booster. Um, and it was getting really, really tired. And, like, the number of people that were putting in the next jab was just going down and down and down and down and down. And we just hit that saturation point, but the death counter was going up and up and up. And the propaganda was going up and up and up. And one day, we were told you don't go outside, you social distance, you wear a mask, you inject yourself, you need the booster. And if you don't do that, you're a grandma killer. But one day, Putin invades Ukraine, and suddenly we had to all go outside and wave Ukrainian flags and say that we're defending democracy. And guess what? We don't need any more injections, and the crisis is over, and the death count is going down and down and down. And you don't necessarily need to wear your mask anymore. But you have to understand that Putin is Hitler, and you have to have a Ukrainian flag in your social media profile. And you have to understand, if you're in the UK and you're seeing this homelessness, suicide rates at highs, drug addictions, racial and immigration tensions at record
Rape
heights,
gangs.
all of this, this stuff. But the most important thing is that the Bank of England prints $3 billion, sends it over to Ukraine, so the CIA installed Zelensky can dish some of it out and spend it back on military equipment to prop up the US, UK, German, and French and Israeli stock market. And by the way, just so happens that Palantir is beta testing all of its drone integrations into the drones in Ukraine, as well as Israel testing everything on genocide as a service in Gaza and occupation as a service in West Bank. And now let's change the leadership. Open borders to closed borders. ICE, Palantir. The share price goes up in Core Civic and GEO Group. Now you're radicalized into believing that the people over the borders are killing you, whether it's true or not. And now we need to close the borders. And guess what? Palantir's already got the solution. All right, now we have protests, domestic terrorism. So the color revolution that they were using for decades and decades abroad is now being used at home. And then we get documents showing that the CIA interfered in, the January the 6th and various other things. So we know the script. Like, this is getting really, really tired right now. And if you're like in a cult that's perpetuating that, like, I'm sorry, you are the product that they created. And sadly, the only thing that we can do, anyone that's escaped that, is try and create our own little corner where we're immune to those little things. And we can sit outside the system, because you believing that belief is serving the very power that you think you're protesting against.
There it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, if this is, if the paradigm is that we're actually under attack, and of course, they create the crises always to get what they really want installed, right? So right now, I think 89% of Americans are dead set against flock cameras. Doesn't matter. They're all going up as fast as they possibly can put them in, right? So it's part of that control grid and everything. And I think we're going to need it, because right now, I just checked futures really quick, and it turns out, wouldn't you know it, oil's red already, even though the strait is closed and all of that stuff, because they've created a narrative structure that what you do is you sell oil, and whether they're goosing that with some treasury shorts or Japan's helping, well, I don't care. They've created the narrative structure that, wow, we don't need this stuff. But here's the reality. This is the big four in the United States. That's crude plus SPR. So that's commercial and SPR, gasoline, distillate, jet fuel, right? We're headed towards tank bottom. And because they're holding prices down, guess what? Demand is up. Demand is up 2.9% year over year, more flights, more cars. So I think they're just going to keep doing this. Here's the paradigm. They just keep doing this. They hold the price of oil too low. Demand remains too high relative to supply. And eventually you run out of supplies. And then you go, oh no, Simon, huge emergency. Nobody could have seen this coming. We used to do the even odd license plate things, but people figured out how to game that. You're just going to have to download this, your gas code, your little QR code. You're just sorry. You're just going to have to participate in this digital ecosystem to get what you need. And they start doling out energy, right? As the control mechanism. And then they get everything they wanted in the first place. You don't travel. You live in 15-minute cities. You can't afford to eat meat. All the stuff they said they were going to do happens because of the crisis that's about to unfold. And I think that's kind of how I'm seeing it right now. I can feel this coming.
Yeah, I think you got it. And you can see the beta test. That's what happened in Cuba. That's exactly what happened in Cuba. They manufacture an energy crisis through sanctions. And then you're downloading an app in order to divvy out your access and your credits towards energy. And then they'll move to the next iteration, which is tokenize it and make it programmable. That World Economic Forum vision, they've told us everything that they're looking to do. And they're doing it. They're winning. They're not losing. Trump's not draining the swamp. Trump is really filling the swamp. He's really
turned it into a protected
and he's
wetland.
getting rich from it. And that's all his job is. Fill the swamp and get rich from it. That's his job. And then create a narrative that feeds the cult so that you think that something else has happened. And eventually you'll be so dissatisfied that suddenly you'll want J.D. Vance, who was groomed by Palantir and Peter Thiel. Okay, great. Or you go extreme to the left and whoever the next groomed that works for the same lobby in a different flavor that has a left-leaning narrative for the same agenda that was pushed by the right-leaning freedom narrative. And so it's all it's all BS. And if you want to see a business plan for what the World Economic Forum would like to do, a while back, the Wall Street Journal leaked a business plan for what they wanted to do to Gaza. And they wanted to give the Gazans give up their land and put it in a trust. And then they tokenize it, and it's managed by Tony Blair and a bunch of technocratic, Western interests. And you can imagine the price manipulation on that token to make sure you own nothing and you're happy. And what is the happy part? The happy part is the universal basic income. So create unemployment through AI, push down the price of goods whilst simultaneously pumping the price of assets so that you don't own the asset, but you're just a consumer. The price goes down and they give you just enough universal basic income to make sure that the consumption market doesn't fall so that you can pump the share valuations. And that is the UBI. That is the AI world that they're trying to get to. Now, whether they get there or not is another thing. But if you look at what they want to do, just look at that Gaza plan. It had Elon Musk data centers. It has tokenized land. It had a surveillance system managed by the likes of, there was an Elon Musk center. There was a Trump tower. There was, a surveillance system that is basically just the personification of the control grid. And they'd like to, you've already got I think they're calling it freedom cities in America. They're calling them smart cities in China. And you can see exactly what they want to build. These are the beta tests. So it's there. Palantir was used, the annual pilgrimage in Saudi Arabia, where all the Muslims go, millions of Muslims go every year. The crowd control was done by Palantir. The NHS data, the Department of Defense data in the UK, all the immigration border policies, these are all being managed by Palantir. ICE, Department of Government Efficiency. How did he do saving your money? We did get all your data, and he centralized all your data. And is it really a coincidence that David Sachs from PayPal is the SAR in AI, the crypto and AI SAR, and the only thing you get is stablecoin policy and tokenization Clarity Act securities. No Bitcoin strategic reserve, just a bunch of that. And Peter Thiel, after collapsing Silicon Valley Bank, creates his own bank that's stablecoins. And after getting everyone to withdraw their money, suddenly rebuilds the banking infrastructure. And what is he doing? Crypto-backed loans. You put your crypto as collateral and you get a stablecoin loan. You have a banking system that has all the rails. Is it a coincidence that Peter Thiel's investing in Palantir and all the AI structure that came from In-Q-Tel and was originally DARPA funded, the CIA venture arm, and the Department of Defense research that created Palantir in the first place on the state budget? Is it a coincidence that Elon Musk was able to borrow against his Tesla stock in order to acquire X, so that then he could get a $1.7 trillion valuation on XAI and Starlink integrated into what we're told is a space company, where if you actually read the S1 filing, 90% of the revenue comes from AI infrastructure and data centers. But of course, it's a space company, so let's invest in space. And now you can print stock in order to buy Cursor and all the AI programming things at a $2 trillion valuation. That's a nice money printer to be given, a $2 trillion valuation, so you can spend your stock and acquire everything. Is it a coincidence that Peter Thiel, David Sachs, Reid Hoffman, deeply connected to the Epstein files, Elon Musk, yep, they all worked in PayPal, seem to come to our life in a very dramatic story. They all seem to create businesses from garages, and these geniuses that have now figured out how to be now a trillionaire. But they seem to be completely dependent upon military contracts, financing by the FIC, and they're building the technology that is privatizing this control grid. Pretty coincidental.
Sounds a lot like Hollywood, where once you peel that back, or the music business, you peel that back, you find out that there's a lot of talented people out there, but the ones who make it had to make some deals with the devil, as it were. You have to play the game, and it's a dark game.
If there's one thing to learn from the Epstein files, is that there is, compromise is a tool. And we know that, really. We know that from how does the mafia work? Your first initiation in the mafia is you got to go and cap someone because you need to demonstrate that you're the type of person that's able to climb. And if you're at the very top, you got the most compromise. If you're rising, you got more compromise. I experienced that just when I worked in investment banking. I know what you needed to do to continue to climb the ladder. And I know that parties sometimes seem like testing, whether you're going to eat the apple, whether you're going to take the drug, whether you're going to sleep with the prostitute. And maybe if you take that one, then suddenly everyone gets younger and younger. And then if you really want to climb the ladder when they've already got you half compromised, you're like, all right, I'm too deep. All this to say is that you can see this manufacturing process, and really more of that has been exposed to us. Yeah, it's how power works.
Probably always has, probably will for a long time. But given all that, you mentioned something before, like this is kind of exhausting. It wears a lot of people down. I've been hearing that more and more from people in my own tribe that like, oh, geez, we don't know what to believe anymore. So that's when 5th generation warfare is fully effective. You don't even believe your own self anymore. Right. But, so we have major trust issues. Like I used to be able to trust data, at least minimally, like, okay, if the EIA says there's this many barrels in storage, I just showed a chart before. Now I don't know I really don't know at this point. So that's sort of disorienting, right? And then it's just this nonstop slop that, they put out these narratives that are just completely junk, right? Charlie Kirk was shot with a 30-06 right in the soft part of the throat. Neck of steel, right? It's just slop, right? It doesn't comport with like basic physics, like 9/11. Just that's a nonstop physics violation, right? That storyline. So it's all exhausting. How do you combat that, and how do you live your life given all that?
Yeah, I think it's a constant challenge, and then if you add to that, if you're like on the breadline of financial stress, which most people are, then these are really traumatizing times. Um, I think I try and draw back to what do I believe in,
Mm-hmm.
and you got to get to a place where you kind of have your own beliefs and you're able to question. So start with something. What's real? Well, touch grass. Turns
Mm-hmm.
out that when I look out in the garden, the world doesn't seem quite as scary as when I open X. Yeah, when I open X, the world seems like a really bad place. But when I sit out in the garden, I don't see people killing each other. I don't see these things. You know what I mean? So touch
Mm-hmm.
grass. You got to get yourself into your own reality, and then you ask, well, what's real? Well, I think I own that money in the bank account, but I know that this cash probably not letting me spend it anymore, and that's where it's going. But the hairdresser still accepts this. I can still get a haircut. And they don't probably want to pay anything on it, and they'd rather have some cash. Uh, and where's my savings? Well, I know most people. Well, I can touch this bar of gold. I got to figure out the challenge of how to store it, and hopefully, I don't end up storing it with someone else, and that goes wrong. But if I have to store it with someone else, what's the best amount of legal protection? But can I hold this gold? Um, Maybe you don't, but I've studied Bitcoin enough to say that I trust how that structure works, and so I know I've got that Bitcoin, and I know that I know enough about it to say that I own that, and no one can take it away unless they try and wrench attack me and kill me. So how do I create some security around me? Well, actually, what really matters in the end, um, is you know, it's going to be firstly the mental game, me, the health game. I need a healthy vassal. um, and I probably need a good relationship. For me, I've been married for a long time, and it's probably the best thing that has supported me through the trials and tribulations. So what are they trying to do? They're trying to make men and women hate each other. They're trying to confuse people whether you are a man or not, whether you are a woman or not. I mean, things are just getting weirder and weirder to make sure that you don't just have a nice family. We're probably going to have to figure out to have some children. It looks like the replacement rates are making us extinct. We're probably going to have to build a family, but guess what? They tried to make it unaffordable so you couldn't have one.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so these are real decisions that people have to make. But at the basics is how do I earn my income? Am I dependent upon one source of income? What happens if that goes away? How can I start to increase my income? How can I start to hedge that a bit? How can I focus on that? Once I got my income, am I spending less than I earn? Am I investing the difference? Because the only thing that's going to help you beat this cycle is buying more assets every month. And then you have to decide which assets. That becomes a new challenge. But if you don't have assets, you're not in the game. You're losing. This is the rules. Um, so you make sure you're getting more assets each month. You're spending less than you earn. You may even need to decide what happens if I don't pay that debt. I can't make that decision for you. There's consequences, but some people are in a position they can never get out of, and maybe bankruptcy is the right decision. Who knows? Um, but you got to think about what's right for you, and then what's right for your family, and then you look around you and you say, what's right for our community? Um, is that farmer going bankrupt? Because then I'd probably like some meat, or I'd probably like some vegetables that are not injected with poison. Whatever your health understanding is, you come to your conclusion. So maybe I need to support the people around me. Maybe we can just cut out a few of these big companies and maybe create some parallel supply chains. Maybe we could all buy a bit of food together and buy it from a local farmer with good produce, and we'll figure out how to support that because I know the big supermarket chain wants to take them out. um, and just try and get as localized and community driven as you possibly can. And then look at your AI and say, is there a way I can? I guess at the moment I'm choosing between the American stack and the Chinese stack. Chinese stack let me go open source. Maybe over the years I can work with someone to build my own decentralized infrastructure as well as run nodes and have my own financial systems, and you just work through it. And what I'd say is they want you driven towards urgency. The psyops are making you think you need to earn all your money now, and you need to gamble, and you need to invest in the next crypto, and you need to borrow against it, and you need to do it with leverage, and you need to engage in the futures market. Or I need to borrow against, and I need to lever up. All of those mechanisms are trying to drive you to a shorter time frame, and forget the long term. And so you need to remind yourself that actually the world's not it. Although we got these big things and things are blowing up, as long as I can create my own environment in a way where I'm okay, then maybe I can exit some of that and build a 10-year plan, because you're going to need a 10-year plan. From where you are right now, write it down. And as long as you're buying more assets every month, then you're working. Am I getting worse off or better off? And there's no quick solution. There's no quick fix. They're going to try and make you think, get rich quick or whatever it may be. All of these things they just don't work. There's no substitute for the longer term plan and thinking longer term. And that's the challenge today. You do have to set an environment for yourself where there is a brighter future. And you need to be real. You need to see the world as it is, but not worse than it is or better than it is. And once you've got that realism, I think you just need a plan for what your life look like and what you can do. And just get yourself a nice mentoring community and group of people that are kind of all going to do that with you and share the right information. And I see it in myself. I've got to get that balance right. Am I being overly negative, overly, positive here? We want to get that balance. And I don't know. That's all I can give you, really.
I love it. And I think the compilation of that is become decentralized, and that's what I've been doing in my own life. I work on the planning board, probably run for select board again, just getting much more involved locally. And it's really what Luke Roman says. I kind of have the 15th century German mercantilist, the Jakob Fugger portfolio, 25% gold or silver, 25% real estate, 25% cash, hold, just waiting to see liquidity. And then 25% what he called, we would call stocks, but he called investments in high quality companies. And so for me, that's on the energy side. I really love natural gas here in the United States at this point. But from the production side, I wouldn't own an LNG company to save my life because I think they're going to get shafted. Longer story, but I think that's about right. And the other thing I got from Luke Roman was, you know what? You do that and you just have to be mentally prepared. You're going to lose some soldiers, right? I think part of that mindset they try and get us invested in, on Wall Street is you have to be winning all the time, right? And you just can't do that in this environment. The risks are unknown. It's going to be a fairly chaotic outcome. And so that's what I'm mentally prepared to wake up one day and find out I can no longer access those fantasy digits in my bank account. Might happen, know?
And I think we all end up back on, the spiritual path. I'm not here to tell you what your spiritual path is, but I'm clear about, who I work for and who the ultimate creator is and my ideology around that. But I think in the end, like to manage this transition, because it is a transition. We're in the world that we have been brought up in is not the world that we're moving towards. So this is change. And with change is opportunity and destruction. So we are going through that. So just recognize it. And in the end, it's going to be your spiritual connection to whatever is right for you, in terms of a higher purpose that's going to get you through that. And that internal game is something that we all need to. I believe that it becomes increasingly more important. And I'm definitely not here to tell you what you should believe in there. But I know what I believe in there, and that's what's going to get me through these changes.
I totally agree. It's I've been getting more and more spiritual about everything, and it was been a huge help for me. I grew up religious light, Easter, Christmas in the church. That was about it. But didn't never was taken through reading the Bible. So I started reading the Bible, and first off, it's just a history text. I'm like, oh my gosh, Simon, humans have done this over and over again, like this the same thing, right? Romans is just like reads like today, in some sections. Um, so it helped connect me with the idea that we're going through a cycle right now. And when you go through these cycles, like I have a lot of goals in life, but my number one goal that sits under all of them is I don't want to lose my humanity. And I feel like the bids for attention on X, it's really just there to dehumanize everything, and get us fighting with each other, and to see the enemies on a horizontal structure when in fact probably should be looking in a more vertical structure. And so it's just divide and conquer, right? But I feel like they're dividing us not only from each other, but dividing me from within myself, from self, right? So I can sort of recognize that. If I put a term on it, the most catch-all collective term that works really well, if I need just one, is evil, right? What is evil like? It likes to destroy, degrade, debauch, death. It just likes to break stuff. And so when I watch like how Israel participates, when it goes into a country, it just the crystallizing moment where I was just like, was watching. There was this beautiful restaurant some family had owned for generations, and it was shaped like a boat, and it was a popular tourist destination. It was just like, it was beautiful. Well, they just planted charges in it and blew it up and filmed it and put it online. You know why? Because it was destructive. It was just an act of evil destruction, pointless destruction. And that's what they want to telegraph to the world is like, this is how we're going to behave, right? And then the point of that is the point of that is to show you they're just here to destroy, right? And then watching my own country do the same sorts of things and adopt the same sort of tactics and all of that, it's demoralizing, and that's what I have to fight against because of all the D's that I think evil engages in. Demoralization is probably the most insidious. Because that's different than depression. When you're demoralized, your psycho spiritual self has been attacked. Your cognitive map of how things should happen and what's unfolding around you don't line up. You're a tiger in a cage, right? It's demoralizing.
And what I recommend is that most people like probably chose to read the Bible because of their background, and so I'd encourage people to, if you've read the Bible, then also read the Torah, because they want you to think that the Jews are those radical Zionists in Israel, and also read the Quran because they want you to believe that those that follow the Quran, the Muslims, are ISIS. And also read the Bhagavad Gita or whatever it may be, because they want you to believe that all those Indians and Hindus are those crazy people that we get. I'm sure you get them across your feed, that are beating women and engaging in all these crimes against humanity. Um, they are making those connections, and you're probably, I tell you, when I read those scriptures and those books, um for example, like when I read the Quran, I realized, so everything I've been told that was in the Quran isn't actually in the Quran. It was in other
Mm.
texts, and those other texts were actually connected to politics, and those political Islam is actually completely different to that book and the Quran, and then the translations were changed over time and manipulated over time, and I'm not saying this is we're overwhelmed with things to do, but all I'm saying is, in order to not end up blaming the other, try and understand the psyop that has been implanted upon the other, because what we're witnessing in Israel with these radical Zionists is not necessarily what people that practice Judaism want you to believe about how they are.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the same here. And so, this is the game. We have to have a higher level of intelligence or empathy, and once you recognize the psyop, you start questioning Why do I believe that? Who told me that? Where did that come from? You know, and so that's what I say. Again, we gone very off finance and geopolitics, but hey, what are we on earth to do here if it's not for build a better relationship between our humanity, our creator, and the spirit?
Well, I agree, and to me, I just like to I like to have as clear a view of the actual circumstances, so I understand what I'm up against, right? And so I happen to think that a number of those radical Zionists you're talking about, they're not religious at all. They are psychopaths who've hijacked a particular structure for their own, you know, evil tiny ends. But corporations become psychopathic in their construct as well with that dark triad, right? You know, they just how that short term money focus drives you. And my core conclusion is that if we really want to fix things, money should be a neutral medium of exchange, but it's not. We have a corrupt money system. And by corrupt, I mean it's corrupt if you or I could sit down in a room and decide to steal from everybody through this process of inflation while enriching a few people, because we have the system of money by its very design is corrupt. And I don't think, Simon, you could put as many laws, rules, regulations, penalties around that, and it's going to still be corrupt and corrupting, because at its core, it's a corrupt system, right?
You know, I completely agree. And the at the core, in its simplest denomination, fiat currency is a debt, and a debt has interest. The money to pay the interest doesn't exist unless you issue a new loan. And at the root of the whole thing, that brings us to where we are today. And you roll that over and roll that over until it can no longer be rolled over, and then you reset the game and you play it somewhere else. And so, you know, the monetary system has all of these consequences that drive behavior that brings us to where we are. And so, having fought that battle for it was my father lost all his money in the dot-com boom and bust, and he asked me to figure out what happened to his money because he didn't know. And that was 26 years ago. And in the 26 years of doing, it's quite sad really, doing nothing but obsess over trying to figure out everything about all of these different monetary topics and where they take you for the last 26 years. Whether it be politics, whether it be creating a business, whether it be trying to start a bank, whether it be involved in Bitcoin, whether it be, trying to change the system in any type of way, I've kind of come to the conclusion that I'm not sure if we can fix it. But what does that mean? Because when you're faced with a Ponzi scheme, imagine the behavior that drives you to, right? If you're faced with a Ponzi scheme, there's a couple of ways you can go. One is you can just call it out and then you lose your money because the whole thing blows up. Or you could find yourself in a position where, well, maybe I could just bring in another investor and then I can get out. And that decision is kind of the decision that we all make. And here's my thinking. I think our time on earth, I think we try to fix things, but I don't think we do fix things, because I think that yin and yang, that good and bad, that evil, is what the world is about actually. And we're tested. And when we're presented with evil, do we respond with more evil or do we respond with more good? And my belief is that when you're presented with good and you're presented with evil and you put more good in, you get more good out. And every time I've looked at my life and I've done that thing that I knew I shouldn't do, but it was questionable, that's cost me 10 times more than that decision initially. And every time I look back and I say, that was a really hard decision. Like I went down the right path, but that was a really hard decision to make. Like 10 years later, I look back and I say, that was the key defining moment of my life. The reason I made that decision, and that's why I am here today. And so but that's what I think life is. I think it's a test, and you're presented with more good and more bad, and we're humans. We're infallible. Sometimes we go down the dark path, and we need to correct it. And we know it. It's internal. We know when we're doing wrong. We know when we're doing good. But sometimes you trick yourself into believing something like a radical Zionist or someone in ISIS, that they may not know that they're a useful idiot for a greater power structure and they're performing a role that they don't understand they're performing, normally by the CIA or Mossad or MI6 or something. Um, but somehow they got themselves in a position where they said, me betraying the 10 commandments or me betraying the 5 pillars is okay. And I'm still just going to go out and kill people because I've persuaded myself that I'm doing God's work in some way, and these are going to be offset. And how they got themselves in that position is what we need to make sure never happens to us. Because we know when you've pushed yourself down a path, then you start justifying your actions, and then but you knew it was wrong. And then your lie becomes so big that you end up believing your bullshit, and then you become a person that you were not born to be. And we need more people that are back to their spirit and their soul of, I personally believe that we were all born good people and we got radicalized into a different version of ourselves, and you can de-radicalize yourself. I don't think we were born evil. I do think there are evil forces, um, but I think all humans were born good. I think every child was born good, and somehow they got radicalized into something that is not them, and we need to get back to who we actually are.
Well, we'll need proper mentors, proper guides, role models, etc. You know, there's precious few of them out there right now. Politically, I can't hardly think of any. But what you said is absolutely true in my life. That the thing I do that's really hard, right? When I look back, that's why I'm here today, right? So in the Bible, it would be, you know, the path to righteousness is narrow, by which I think I interpret that to mean that evil is kind of like the default setting. It's not like this thing you have to actively choose, although people can do that. But that's like, if you don't examine things, you just end up down that path. And it's always that little process of co-option. They don't just ask you to line people up and shoot them in the back of the head in a ditch on day one. There's a little, it's like you said, those parties you went to, you know, like it's a corrupting process, right? I think that's actually easy, that corrupting process. Harder is saying no, doing the right thing, speaking up when it's, you know, as I tell people, the time to speak up is when it's hardest. It's easy after the fact. Like everybody can be a COVID jab critic now because it's, okay, we all saw that was a bad idea. But at the time, ooh, that was hard, right? And so, you know, the people who did stand up and said that out loud, many of them lost their jobs, lost their livelihoods, lost their houses, you know, as a consequence. But they were saying what they believed because, like you said, they knew for themselves, like, no, this isn't right. Not participating. That's hard, but courage is contagious. So we need more people who are willing to say the hard stuff, you know, when it's needed.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And that's been my experience. Like, it was really hard to talk about what was happening in Palestine on October the 7th. Now it's really easy to talk about it. It was really hard to talk about Ukraine and Russia, you know, in 2022. Now it's pretty easy to talk about it. But yeah. And you notice it. You go back and you look and you're like, and you see those people that rewrite history. You know, they come out 2 years later, and then they say, yeah, I was always pro-Palestinian or anti-Israel, or I was always, you see the rewriters of history. But yeah, it is the hardest time is in the moment when it is the hardest. Like, you know, if you're talking about Israel on October the 7th, whew, that was hard. That got me, blocked, that got me, you know, debanged, that got me hated, that got me that had significant consequences in terms of my personal network and what people thought about me. But a lot of them came back a couple of years later and said, hey, let's talk about Israel, and suddenly they're talking about Israel now. So it is definitely, there is a very, very difficult time to do it, and that's the time when it's most most impactful. And it's very rewarding a couple of years later when someone kind of comes back to you and says, "Hey, Simon, I really judged you on that. I thought you were really evil, in fact, like, because I just had
Mm-hmm.
no idea what was happening. I had no idea, and now I get it. And thank you for you know, bringing it to my attention, because it took me a long time to really figure out that everything I thought was a lie."
That went off like a bomb in my, at that time, I was still very deeply invested in the COVID community, you know, and we had all these different independent researchers. And then some of them turned out just like they were Jewish or, you know, really pro-Israel. And they're just like, Chris, you have to condemn Hamas. You have to. I'm like, no, I don't really have to. I don't. That alone was an insufferable insult. I was like, you know, because I know enough about, I know how well defended that border is. 6 hours without a response is not possible, right? You know, steel frame buildings do not collapse due to fire alone. There's just certain things you just know, you know, I can't go against what I know to be true, because that's my reality, you know?
And it's fairly obvious that those that are going to benefit from rebuilding Gaza had an interest in destroying Gaza.
Yeah. God, we could keep going, but I've kept you long enough here. It's just fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for your time, your insights. Very generous with both here today. And so, where do people follow you? How should they stay in touch?
So I give real time updates on X at Simon Dixon Twit is where I spend a bunch of my time. When I'm not touching grass and I want to be radicalized.
Yep.
And then what I try and do as a discipline on my YouTube channel at Simon Dixon 21. It's very geeky, but I go for like 2 to 4 hours every Friday, where I go through everything that happened this week and my alternative interpretation of it. And you know, kind of make some predictions and analyze what I got wrong. And so if you're, you can subscribe to me on YouTube there. And then because it's such a big brain dump and I talk for a long time and I don't know how to do things quickly, I chuck it all into AI on simondixon.com. And then it creates very nice blogs and 5-minute videos that says what took me 4 hours to say, or a 20-minute video. And so I publish all those on simondixon.com because one day I may not be allowed to use YouTube or not be allowed to use X. So I make sure I back it all up and document it.
Fantastic. Well, thanks again. And thank you, everybody, for listening. If you want to follow more, go to those sites. We'll have them listed down below. And otherwise, love to see your comments about all of this, because we covered a lot of territory. And these are big times, and we are all navigating them together. So until next time, bye for now.